Good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for joining us for this discussion on urban growth and access to opportunities. My name is Homi Karas. I'm the Director of the Global Economy and Development Program, and we are very honored to have today a discussion about a really quite path-breaking report, I would say, on urban growth and access to opportunities focused in Latin America, produced by the Development Bank for Latin America, or CAF. I still don't quite know why you guys have changed your name. I mean, after years and years of branding, and then suddenly there's something new. Yeah, it's really confusing. So, I just wanted to start by saying that, at least for me, I do a lot of work on the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals and the development agenda more broadly, at the end of the day, you start to understand that the real battle for sustainability in development is actually a battle for how cities and urban areas will really develop. And that is the consequence of two things that I hope you keep in the back of your minds. The first is that just in terms of the rate of urbanization, there are now more people moving to urban areas than ever before, and more people moving to urban areas than ever will again. In other words, we are in absolutely a short window of probably about 15, maybe 20 years of absolute peak urbanization in terms of absolute numbers of people. Why? Because you still have large chunks of the world that are urbanizing, although Latin America has already urbanized quite significantly. But then after, of course, when everybody is already mostly urbanized, the rate of urbanization falls down. So partly because of that huge expansion of urbanization, there's a huge need to finance urban infrastructure and urban development. If you get that right, you have a chance of sustainable development. If you get it wrong, game over. And as we think about moving economies towards decarbonization, low-carbon pathways, it really means how can we actually have sustainable development? The reason I emphasize the development part is because the way in which the urban areas are trying to develop is not just about making them low carbon places. It's about giving access to a range of opportunities, because at the end of the day, urban areas are where people can effectively earn better livelihoods. So better opportunities, while at the same time reducing their carbon footprint. That is the big key. So it's got the social dimensions of opportunities and fairness and access. It's got the environmental dimensions of low carbon, and it's got the economic dimensions of being places where, thanks to agglomeration economies, we can really generate prosperity. So it's actually, it's really interesting, because when you think about access in that sense, you start to realize that access is not the same thing as congestion. I mean, I came into work today, and there's some event happening up at the Hilton Hotel with the government, so they closed off all the damn roads, and you get stuck. So you can have congestion in cities, but at the same time, actually very good access. In places like Washington, places like New York and the United States have very good access to opportunities, even though they're also very congested. And that, in some sense, is the real sort of, meat of this report. I think we're going to have a discussion about the way in which cities finance themselves. That's always difficult. a little bit about the way in which the governance of cities is arranged. That's always quite difficult because metropolitan areas are not the same as individual cities, and how they tie up to national goals and strategies is always quite different. We're going to have a bit of a discussion about new data. One of the really exciting things now in all of the urban development areas is the ability to define cities now in a consistent way across countries using new metrics, particularly geospatial metrics. So all of this, I think, leads to a very, very rich discussion. What we're going to do is the following. There's going to be a short presentation of the report, and then we're going to have a panel. The panel will be moderated by our own Elena Harkness. She's working on the project on 21st century city governance and is on leave from the MacArthur Foundation. She served on the City of Chicago's Community Development Advisory Committee and the board of Chicago Women in Philanthropy. Also on the panel, we will have Eduardo Lora, Senior Fellow at Harvard's Center for International Development. He's been Chief Economist of the Inter-American Development Bank and Executive Director of FEDESarrollo in Colombia. Pablo Sanguinetti is the Director of Economic Analysis and Knowledge for Development in the Development Bank of Latin America. So he's basically the guy in charge of the report. And Juan Vargas is the guy who actually wrote the report and has done all of the work. He's a principal economist in the Development Bank of Latin America. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Juan for a short presentation of the report. Is the report available? Online. Online. So the report is available online. It's this. It's called Urban Growth and Access to Opportunities, a Challenge for Latin America. There's a lot of meat in this report, so I would not recommend that you think that you can just lightly skim through. If you want to get into it, get into it. Otherwise, pay attention to Juan. Juan.
Thank you so much, Homie. And I'm very thrilled to be here. I'm very excited. I'm thankful to Brookings for the invitation and for hosting this event. So if you want to learn about the report, you won't be doing much by listening to me for 20 minutes. It's a very short period of time. So I do encourage you to read it. I will just briefly summarize the main contributions of the report. And then, as Homie said, Pablo Sanguinetti is the guy in charge. So he will be answering most of the difficult questions this time. Okay, so let me just start by repeating something that Homie already said, which is that Latin America is a region that is nowadays very urbanized. So urbanization rates in Latin America are almost 80% on average. Which is a figure that is very close to the urbanization of the US and is even higher than urbanization in Europe. And not only that, but Latin America is the region of the world that has urbanized more rapidly, and the rate of urbanization in the last 15 years has been the highest in Latin America. And there are countries in Latin America that are still being or going through a very rapid urbanization, such as Bolivia. So why does it matter that Latin America is already very urbanized and the rates are very similar to those of the US and Europe? Well, because we all know, and there's a lot of research, both historical and contemporary research, on the fact that there is a strong positive relationship between urbanization and development, right? So that means, it's difficult to establish causality, and economic historians have said that the causality goes in both ways, but that means that more urbanized countries tend to be more developed. Well, that is not the case in Latin America if we compare it to the US and Europe, of course, right? So And that's important because then the big question of the report is, okay, why has Latin America not reaped all the benefits of its high urbanization rates? And there are many answers to this. Some of them have to do with the kind of urbanization that happened in Latin America and the rest of the developing world, and the timing of that urbanization. So it was an urbanization that was not necessarily related with industrialization, right? But it also has to do with kind of policies that are in place in urban areas in Latin America. This report emphasizes the second type of answers. It's not that we don't believe that the type of urbanization and the timing matters. It does matter a lot, but there's been already a lot of research about that by economic historians and urban economists. So when you write a report like this, the first thing you want to do is to compare Latin America with the rest of the world, right? And when you write a report on some other topic, it's very easy to do because there are data sets available that compare countries across lots of dimensions. But there are no data sets available that compare cities across many dimensions. Of course, there are exceptions, such as the Atlas of Urban Expansion of NYU, Lincoln Institute, and UN Habitat. But the problem with the Atlas of Urban Expansion is that it has very limited coverage. It only covers 200 cities in the world, about 20 of which are in Latin America. So in terms of drawing conclusions from cross-country comparisons, it only helps so much. So what we do is that we measure the extension of cities in all the world, cities about 100,000 inhabitants, using nighttime light satellite pictures. And let me just summarize very briefly what we do. I'm not going to go through the technical details of our measurement, but this is how the world looks like when you take a nighttime satellite picture of it. And if you zoom up to the US, this is how the US looks like. And of course, nightlight activity has to do with economic activity, right? So there's a lot more economic activity in the East Coast and in the Midwest than in all, I don't know if the pointer works. No, not in the screen. That in all the area left to the Midwest, if you want. But this is not enough to measure the size of cities, because if this was enough to measure the size of cities, then you would conclude that there is one big city from Chicago to the East Coast and from Florida to Maine. And that is not the case, of course. So you need to apply a lot of technical sort of qualifiers and technical corrections to this measure. I'm not going to go through them, right, because this is not a technical talk. But let me zoom up to the DC area. And basically what we do after applying all these corrections is come out with a measure of the extent of the metropolitan area of DC as measured by the reach of its economic and social activity, right? So the DC diamond is kind of in the middle of it, and then you have lots of the greater DC metropolitan area to the right in Maryland, and to the left in Virginia, right? And then as Eduardo will argue, you could even, if you relax a little bit, the thresholds that you need to make for the cities not to be super big, then you could also have the Baltimore area in the north. But Eduardo will talk about that. So this allows us to measure cities and to draw conclusions about cities and compare cities of Latin America with cities of the rest of the world. So let me just give you an example of that. We can compare the size of the Bogota metropolitan area with Lima, Paris, and Chicago. And this comparison is very telling of what actually happens in the data on average, right? This is an example of an average result that we find, which is that Latin American cities are quite small compared to cities in Europe and in the US, right? By the way, this picture also shows how we can measure the extent to which cities grow over time, because we have these measurements for 2000 and 2010, okay? So turns out that Latin American cities are smaller in terms of sprawl, but in terms of population, they are very similar to cities on average, very similar to cities in the US and in Europe, right? And the two things combined, what they mean is that densities, population densities in Latin American cities are pretty high, right? This is something we find in our data set. This is something also that the Atlas of Urban Expansion has found. And this is actually data from the Atlas of Urban Expansion, just to show you that there are similarities in the two data sets. And this is the density at the city level. And you see that in the right panel is the aggregate of cities, and Latin America has much higher density than Europe and the US. And this higher density is even, the gaps are wider if you focus on mega cities, which are defined by the Atlas of Urban Expansion as cities about 3 million inhabitants, okay? So this is a finding that is interesting. Latin America has densities that are very high. So why does this matter? Because densities and urbanization are good for development and well-being. In what sense? Well, cities offer what urban economists call agglomeration benefits. And those agglomeration benefits have to do with the fact that in cities, cities are there because firms want to be closer to other firms and closer to people because they want to hire labor and exchange inputs and sell their products, and people want to be closer to firms and other people because they want to serve the labor and they want to socially interact, and there is these agglomerations, of course, enhance productivity and well-being, right? So cities are good news because there are agglomeration economies that are good for welfare. So in that sense, what happens in Latin America could be potentially very good news for development. But I already told you that there's a huge development and well-being gap and productivity gap between Latin America and the US and Europe, despite of the fact that densities in Latin America are very high, which means that something else should be happening in Latin American cities. What is it? Well, turns out that this agglomeration, in addition to benefits, also creates a lot of potential costs, which seem to be very high in Latin America. These costs, which urban economists call congestion costs, have to do with a lot of traffic, pollution, housing prices, criminality, and all sort of costs that are related to high urbanization rates and density. So it seems then that what's going on in Latin America in terms of policy is that Latin American cities have not solved the balance between the benefits agglomeration and the costs of congestion in a way that favors the productivity and the well-being of cities. That means that there's a lot of room for policy in cities in the whole world. And especially in Latin America, if you compare Latin America with the US and Europe, right? Which is kind of an unfair comparison, if you wish, because we can also compare, and we do it in the report, Latin America with Sub-Saharan Africa, and turns out that cities are much better in Latin America than in Sub-Saharan Africa. But we want to reach the goal of what's happening in the US and Europe, okay? So what are the policy goals? Well, solve these externalities. So promote agglomeration economies and reduce congestion costs. And this is what we call in the report, promote accessibility, okay? Access to opportunities. And that can be done by increasing agglomeration benefits and reducing congestion costs. And what are the policy dimensions that help us doing that? First, a correct land use regulation and planning. Second, infrastructure and regulation for mobility and transport. Third, making the formal housing market more flexible, okay? And finally, all of these policy dimensions need a better metropolitan governance, in the sense that cities, as I showed for the case of DC, cities are much bigger than administrative municipal boundaries. And in terms of the conceptual definition of cities as, the concentration of economic activity, they go beyond the city boundaries. So you need, in order to have successful policies, you need a lot of coordination at the metropolitan level. Okay? So let me just jump into those policy dimensions. The first one is land use regulation and planning. So there is a debate among urban planners, which is, do cities have to be compact, or can they expand? Okay, and there's a lot of criticism among urban planners of cities in the U.S. because they are very, very wide, and that's probably not what's well for maximizing. Well, our take is that cities naturally tend to grow. Why do they tend to grow? First, because income is growing, and people with higher income want to live in bigger houses, so they go to the suburbs. Second, because there are improvements in transport technology and road infrastructure. And third, because there are overall improvements in technology that allow people to work from home. They don't have to go all the way to the city center. They can connect on Skype and work from home. So people just tend to go away from the city center, and cities tend to grow. So it's kind of unavoidable that cities are going to tend to grow. So, and does it matter that cities grow or not? Well, maybe yes, maybe not. What we think matters the most is that cities are accessible. It's not that they should be compact. They should grow. They should be accessible. And expansion, in terms of physical expansion, is not is compatible with accessibility if that expansion, if there is a flexible land use regulation for that expansion to be planned with infrastructure of transport and services, or if these planning and regulations allow for the creation of different sub-centers, so that not all the people have to do to the same center, right? But they can go to different sub-centers, and so they don't have to go, they don't have to have a lot of commuting. So this is important. And the conclusion of this is that accessibility is compatible with various urban structures, not necessarily with denser cities and more compact cities, but accessibility is also compatible with bigger cities. And it seems, in the case of Latin America, that there is still room for growth in terms of physical sprawl in Latin American cities. So this is kind of a provocative conclusion of the report. Let me just jump to the second policy realm, which is mobility. So the first thing that we do is show that Latin Americans mostly use for commuting public transportation, as opposed to Europe, but mostly as opposed to the US. 90% of US citizens use private cars to commute. So why does it matter that Latin America uses mostly public transportation? Well, because it turns out that they're very dissatisfied with public transportation, and that varies across cities. In Bogota, on average, for instance, 4 out of 10 commuters, they say that public transportation is really bad, right? And they don't like it. So they use this kind of transport the most, right? But they're really dissatisfied with that. Also, we can show that part of this dissatisfaction has to do with a lot of congestion that there is in Latin America, okay? And this congestion can be measured, and we do it right here, by georeferencing the place in which people live and the place in which people go to work, and then in an automatic way with a script that you can write and program in an automatic way, ask Google Maps to tell you how much does it take to go to the place that people work, to the place that people live, to the place that people work, at different times of the day, right? And by doing that, you can sort of plot what's the congestion in a city depending on the hour, and you see these kind of bimodal distributions which show peak hours, which are much bigger in Mexico City than in Buenos Aires, for instance, and relatively very flat in Montevideo, so a city with very little congestion. And then,
Can I ask a question? Or not? Later. There'll be space for Q&A at the end.
okay, so in terms of policies to promote accessibility through mobility and transport, the first type of policies that we emphasize is that users of private cars should internalize the negative externalities that they impose on society in terms of congestion, accidents, and pollution. But if you want to make them internalized through price policies, for instance, congestion charges, you need to improve the quality and the extent of public transportation, right? And the quality issue seems to be very important in Latin America. And one of the reasons the quality issue is important in Latin America is because there's a lot of informal public transportation in Latin America that is not regulated. And of course, you not only need to improve the quality, but build more infrastructure for public transportation. So I'm going very quickly through this because I don't have much time, less than 5 minutes. So let me just tell you what we have in the report briefly about housing markets and urban informality. The first thing is that houses, the affordability of houses is very, very, very low in Latin America. So houses are very expensive relative to the income of people, right? We do the following exercises. Suppose, so we make a lot of household surveys in Latin America. In 13 cities, we make household surveys that are representative of the entire city. And we ask people how much they earn, also measure income with consumption and in different ways. And then we make the following exercise. Suppose people or households save 30% of their income every month to buy a house. So how many years of continuous saving would they need, absent any credit market for the time being, to buy an apartment of 50 square meters? I don't know how much that is in feet, sorry. I'm Latin American, as you can note by my accent. So an apartment of medium value. It turns out that the requirement saving is 70 years in Mexico City, and in Bogota it's almost 50 years, and then there's a lot of variation in Latin America, but the affordability is very low. And that's a problem. Why? Well, that's a problem because one way of solving this is like enhancing the mortgage credit market, and the mortgage credit market is very thin in Latin America, so only 8% of GDP on average. Right? Only 8% of GDP on average. There are superstars like Chile, which is 20% of GDP. Well, in US and Canada, it's over 70%. So there's a lot of room for improvement, mortgage credit markets in Latin America. But the reason of the low affordability is not only that people don't have enough money and they don't have access to credit, but also the fact that houses are very expensive because there are a lot of restrictions to the construction of new and the development of new houses. So there is also a supply problem. So these constraints on housing supply plus the low affordability make it so that in Latin America there's a dual housing market, and lots of people, about a third of Latin Americans, they live in slums. Okay? And this is important because turns out, I don't have this slide here, I had to cut it, but turns out that by different measures of accessibility, the difference between the informal settlements, so the slums, and the formal settlements of cities, so we also make representative household surveys in slums, are huge, right? So there is very little accessibility in slums, and part of the growth of these slums is because these dual housing markets in Latin America. Okay, so what do you need to solve this? You need to make the housing supply more flexible by simplifying regulations, promote demand by promoting access to mortgage, and there are general aspects such, for instance, the fact that not necessarily you need accessible housing, but not private housing, right? So you need also to promote the renting market. The last thing that I want to mention, and I already know that my time is almost up, the last thing that I want to mention is the fact that I mentioned about metropolitan governance. So metropolitan governance is important because, as I said, the actual size of cities in terms of economic activity is much bigger than the administrative limits of cities, we saw in the case of DC, right? So let me give you an example. In Sao Paulo, for instance, the metropolitan area of Sao Paulo, as measured by our database, covers 172 municipalities. The metropolitan area of Mexico City covers 65 municipalities, okay? Out of the 41 cities in Latin America with over 1 million inhabitants, half of them cover at least 12 municipalities. So this is a real issue, and it's an issue that if you compare the availability of metropolitan governance institution in Latin America versus the OECD, it's very low in Latin America. So there's a lot of room for making metropolitan institutions. So these institutions have to have three components that are very important. First, they have to have access to financial and human resources to be effective. Second, the institutional design of the metropolitan governance body has to be according to the complexity of the coordination problem. So it's not the same coordinating like the trash collection than coordinating an integrated transport system, okay? And it has to have political legitimacy. And we have lots of examples of this in the report that I don't have to go through. So this is pretty much it. Remember that I said that there are relatively high densities in Latin American cities, but they do not imply more accessibility in spite of the fact that, in theory, high densities are consistent with big agglomeration economies. So what seems to be happening in Latin America is that the congestion costs are too big. So there's a lot of policy room in the areas that I mentioned. The other thing that is important is that accessibility is consistent with different city structures, and letting cities grow is an option if you plan it in a right way and create subcenters and infrastructure, right? So we're not saying that cities in Latin America should grow. We're saying that they can grow if the policy is right. And there's a lot of need for articulation and coordination at the metropolitan level. So I just want to say that this is the link from which you can download the report, and also you can download part of the data that I have mentioned in terms of household service and the satellite nighttime pictures. Thank you very much for your attention.